Hello, students. We're going to cover a couple assignments today. We're going to cover World War II and the Cold War. All right. So going into World War II, as you may know, we fought countries that had a fascist political setup and ideology, and we're going to talk about fascism shortly. But we're going to fight Nazi Germany and fascist Italy, as well as somewhat fascist Japan, Imperial Japan, and some of their smaller allies. So at any rate, what happens? My goodness, a lot of people turn to the weak 1920s, the weak League of Peace, the League of Nations, and they point to the Versailles Treaty just before that. So at any rate, we were punitive with Germany at the end of World War One. We had the article that was known as the War Guilt Clause, making Germany claim culpability for the war, and we took about a tenth of her territory from her. We took the colonies from the Ottoman Empire in the side of Germany, Austrian Empire. Um, but then under Article 10, we reserved the right to keep our own empires. So it was quite hypocritical. In fairness to the U.S., Wilson was not in favor of this, but he was somewhat outnumbered by his allied partners. And so Germany had some grievances that she's going to nurture for a while until about 1933, when the German National Socialists or the Nazis are going to take control of Germany. All right. And they're going to defy the Versailles Treaty. They also put the Rhineland under international troops, including black African troops that the Nazis are going to run with. They're going to make them pay war reparations, and for quite some time, they wouldn't even put a number on it. They just kept adding to it. And then, of course, Germany went through the Depression like everybody else, and bad inflation. And so when the Nazis came in, they had work programs for everyone, and Hitler had his so-called economic miracle, and he's going to outlaw all the other parties. He's going to use the Enabling Act to become a 6 month dictator. And of course, he turns that 6 months into the rest of his life. Um, yeah, and you have the Nuremberg laws that defined the people's community, the Volksgemeinschaft. And if you were found outside that people's community, supposedly under the infamous meeting of the SS, the final solution was to have you killed, all right, which would be known as the Holocaust. And so, at any rate, Nazi Germany is going to contend that parts of the newly devised Czechoslovakian government has Germanic people in it, and known as the Sudetenland. And they take the Sudetenland, and then that wasn't enough. They took all of the new country of Czechoslovakia. They contended that there was a referendum that it passed in Austria to be annexed to Germany, known as the Anschluss, and they were not allowed to do that under the Versailles Treaty. And they marched troops into the Rhineland, which were they're not supposed to, and they kind of played chicken. And the international troops moved first and got out of the way. And then also they raised much higher than 100,000 man army, which they were not allowed to do. So they completely defied the Versailles Treaty. And so finally, after Neville Chamberlain of England, of Great Britain, told them, we're going to pacify you, right? We're going to pacify the uh, we're going to appease Hitler and Nazi Germany. When they kept just grabbing for more, he had to finally give an ultimatum, and that ultimatum was crossed on September 1st, 1939, with the invasion of Poland. Okay, with Japan, 1936 was a big year. They had a series of concerted political assassinations, and Prince Kanoye, the prime minister, is going to step down out of fear. And the militarists, and not just the militarists, but the right wing amongst the militarists, are going to pretty much take over, as well as their idea of a Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere is how we translate it. Supposedly Asia for the Asians, but as you see with the Japanese and how they treated other Asian conquered countries, it was not humanitarian at all, nor egalitarian at all. So at any rate, Japan is going to take over Korea. Then they move into Manchuria, and then they had an incident called the Mukden incident, where we believe they blew up their own train depot and trains and blamed it on the Chinese and invaded China. The U.S. gave multiple ultimatums to Japan, including putting a moral embargo on them. Any scrap metal, oil, anything that could feed their war machine, we put an embargo on. And then, of course, they end up attacking us at Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. After, for about 2 years, we had stayed neutral in this war. So we will fight with Great Britain and France, somewhat France, because France is going to fall in about 6 weeks to Nazi Germany. But they're going to have a liberation front that's going to continue to put up a fight in spite of the Vichy government. The Vichy government was colluded with Nazi Germany. So at any rate, but before we entered the war, before Pearl Harbor, right? Our leader Franklin Roosevelt met with Winston Churchill of England in Nova Scotia, I believe, and they issued the Atlantic Charter. And in the Atlantic Charter, they stated our war aims and why basically the Allies were the good guys and the fascists were the bad guys. And one of the things that they contended is they were fighting for the dignity and the worth and the human rights of all individuals everywhere in the world. All right, so that's important to remember. So, at any rate, in this introduction, I bring up just war theory. Just war theory comes from Augustine of Hippo and the Roman Catholic Church, and they wanted to systematically set forth a series of criteria whereby someone could be exonerated from killing someone on the battlefield and it not be held against him as a Catholic as murder. And so the two broad categories, right, were the reasons for fighting a war and the manner by which you fight the war. And so it was kind of organic. It grew throughout the centuries. They would add more rules, change rules, etc. And then in the 1600s, a Dutch humanist named Hugo Grotius, Grotius, kind of systematically synthesized, put it all together pretty well. And so, but in a nutshell, right, you're looking at proportionality and chivalry, really. Um, Proportionality in that, if you get a village attacked, you don't use an atomic weapon on a metropolis and kill hundreds of thousands of people in retaliation. But that there's a sense of proportionality. And then the chivalry, right, is that you defend yourself and or you defend someone who cannot defend him or herself. Okay, in fighting this just war. So moving on to the first one, I make the argument that this was a just war for the United States. So this is court history, because we were fighting against fascism and the Holocaust. And just that alone justified intervention. So with fascism, right? It's very organic and corporate. Like you're just a cog in the wheel. You're just like a pinky toe of the body of society. Each individual doesn't mean much. Uh, only means what he or she contributes to the whole body. of society. And so it also is vital that there is conformity and unity in that body, so that the body, right, is not the body members are not fighting against one another, but that they're all cooperating to the same end. So therefore, under fascism, there's no room for dissent. There's no room for disagreement. There's no room for peaceful protest. It's just you have to be in line with what Rousseau had written centuries back as the general will. Okay, and so no individual autonomy, no individual rights, uh, and then also they're able and willing to stifle dissent because it's so vital that everyone's on the same page. If you do disagree, if you do protest, you are to be dealt with forcefully by way of either being arrested or killed, etc. Okay, and so it's kind of scary stuff, this ideology of fascism. And then who gets to decide the general will? I mean, is it like majoritarian, right, where the 50% plus one dictates what's best for the country? Not at all. It's one leader. It's one autocratic leader who they attribute almost a mystical power to know the destiny of his country, to know what's best for his country, to know the direction of his country, etc. So they just call him the leader, but my goodness, does he have power? So it's the Führer, as they called Hitler, the leader, or Il Duce of Mussolini in Italy. And yeah, just a lot more power than a chief executive of a republic like we have as our president. And so that's pretty scary as well. Therefore, the institutionalized use of violence, um, like I said, they violently suppress dissent, and they also are for imperialism. They're for taking over other sovereign countries, and they make no apologies for it. And so, with that, the Germans, they used the term living space, Lebensraum, and um, and then you had the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere as a term used by the Japanese. And so they take over other countries and they would impose a fascist government over the countries that they conquered. All right. So this is kind of scary stuff. And then in addition to that, with Nazi Germany, this is not necessarily a fascist characteristic, but it was of the Nazis, is they kind of imbibed the social Darwinism um, of Herbert Spencer and others, and they took it to a whole new level, almost to a level of like Friedrich Nietzsche in some of his works. Friedrich Nietzsche had said the problem with Christianity is that it aims to preserve that which nature intends to discard. That's some scary stuff, right? So if you are sickly, if you are disabled in some way, right? Nietzsche would say that nature intends for you to be discarded, right? And that you should not be artificially conserved by compassionate Christians, but you should be left to die out. And so the Nazis they came and paid homage to the funeral abode of Friedrich Nietzsche more than once. And so they took his thoughts, right? And they thought, well, let's just expedite the process. Their whole idea with a people's community and the final solution for those who do not fit into the people's community. So if you were on the left, anarchist, communist, socialist, if you were homosexual, if you were long-term homeless, if you were psychologically ill, if you were physically disabled, if you were, I mean, all kinds of things could merit your exclusion from the people's community and get you placed in either a psychiatric ward whereby they would give you shots so that you would become impotent and could not procreate, or put into a concentration camp and killed. All right. So this is scary stuff. And then the Nazis also, when they went into places that they had decided were not part of the people's community, they sometimes just killed them instead of going through the motions of sending them by way of train to the concentration camps, primarily in Austria. They would kill them on the spot. And that's what the Einsatzgruppen was. They were known as the cleanup crew. And I can't even imagine how many people they killed that did not fit into their people's community. All right. So you see a picture of the Einsatzgruppen taking out non-desirables there. That's a graphic picture. I mean, that's in the midst of killing them. That's Joseph Mengele to the bottom right. He's the doctor that performed the grisly experiments on Jewish children at Auschwitz. And that's Hitler and Mussolini on the top left. And that is a Nuremberg rally on the top right. Then what I do on number two is I deflect and I say Japan fought so viciously that they relinquished their right to being the just war party of World War II. And it was mainly against non-combatants. In the second category of how you carry out war, you are not to kill non-combatants. You're to kill other people wearing a uniform and carrying a gun, not civilians. And that's exactly what the Japanese did. So prisoners of war, they're technically to be treated like civilians under the Geneva Conventions, and they were not so under the Japanese. I mean, look at that death rate. That's incredible. Nearly 40% of American prisoners of war under the Japanese did not make it by the end of the war, from 41 to 45. Okay. So they said they were going to treat prisoners of war as circumstances dictate. They refused exchanges of prisoners. They on multiple occasions. They refused to work with the Red Cross. Yeah, it's just it got ugly. The Bataan Death March was in the Philippines, and you see here 5,000 of not quite 20,000 American prisoners of war perished amidst a 65-mile march across the peninsula. They marched at quite a quick pace, evidently, and if you could not keep up, they would kill you. They'd bayonet you. And sometimes they performed the old Roman decimation, where they would just count 10 people, and every 10th person they would prisoner of war, they would just murder in front of the others to instill fear. The Maros Maru episode, American sailors had been torpedoed, and they felt as if they had no option to drowning other than swimming up to the Japanese carrier. And in doing so, they were hacked to pieces instead of being taken in as prisoners of war. And then also, they were forced to do slave labor. They built the Burma-Siam Railway, and of course, they weren't paid a penny. And of course, also in the midst of their labor, they could be physically beaten or even killed at any time. They worked in the factories and mines, etc., that were connected to the companies that had contracts with the Japanese government. They were called Zaibatsu. And get this, one of the companies of the Zaibatsu was Kawasaki. And according to this book, Unjust Enrichment, Kawasaki has never formally apologized for it. So at any rate, then, the rape of Nanjing or Nanking, that was horrific in China. I just tell you, beware if you Google that, because it's just incredible. They had piles and piles of skulls of murdered Chinese civilians. As you see here, they used Chinese civilians as bayonet practice. I mean, it's just awful, awful stuff. All right. And then also, especially in the Philippines, they would take women and use them as comfort women, as prostitutes. But if that weren't bad enough, they sometimes were so brutal to them that they would kill them. The women would end up dying. And some of these women, these so-called comfort women, forced to be such, were prepubescent. They were not women yet. Right. That's an Australian special force guy who tried to perform a rescue and was shot down, and he's about to be beheaded. So then number three, I do a 180 and I say, well, what about the U.S.? Did the U.S. really fight in a manner deserving of just war status? And it's kind of a rhetorical question. The answer is kind of hidden within the, not so hidden within the question. No, not really. Um, we hit non-combatants as well. For one, we engaged in carpet bombing or hitting cities that were filled with civilians of the countries of our enemies. If you look up Dresden, Germany, we supposedly dropped flares at night to be able to see better, and the flares caught fire and caused a great fire in Dresden. Uh, More maliciously, because it was intended, were the incendiary fire bombs that we dropped near wooden buildings in Tokyo and Kobe and other major cities of Japan. Right. And the British had no problem doing this because the Nazi Germans had done it to them, right, with the Battle of Britain and the the siege of England, and they hit London and the major cities and killed thousands of English civilians. So Churchill, especially with his personality, he had no problem with retaliating in kind. But what we tried to do is we said, well, let's at least try to limit this. Let's have a point system. So making war munitions merited the highest number of points. Then if you were engaged in telecommunications, then it would be just under the that in points and so forth. And a city was supposed to merit a certain number of points before you could consider dropping bombs on it. And you could make the argument that it was military related, that you're taking out the military producing capacity of your enemy. But by the time we got to Hiroshima, Hiroshima did not merit on the point system. It did not merit a military target. It just didn't. And for some people, right, they think that's exactly why they hit Hiroshima, because it was pristine, and no one could say, "Oh, it was already destroyed by other type of weaponry." They wanted the people to see the contrast between a relatively pristine looking city and then the site of a nuclear holocaust thereafter. All right. And, we only gave them 3 days, August 6th to August 9th. And we dropped a second one on Nagasaki, even bigger one. Right. And so people have problems with that, obviously. And because what some people contend is that our president used the false dilemma excuse. And with a false dilemma, right, he said that either we're going to have to do a mass invasion of the main Japanese islands, which will be very, very costly in men. Because, of course, he took from the worst, most stubbornly defended Pacific islands that he could. So, like Peleliu, Tarawa, Saipan, the Okinawa. These islands, right? They did. We took very few prisoners of war. We had to kill tens of thousands of soldiers to take these small islands, and uh, and it was quite costly. So his men get together and they pull numbers together and show, on average, through those worst islands, how many men per square foot gained had to be killed to gain that square foot. And then he used that ratio to the Japanese main islands. And, some people were throwing up the number close to 1 million or 500,000 that would hypothetically get killed. So he contended, right, that it was either that or dropping these bombs. Like there weren't other options at all. And so some people talked about a naval blockade and starving the Japanese islands into submission. Some people talked about dropping the bomb there in New Mexico or Nevada or the Bikini Atolls in the Pacific for the Japanese to see as a warning. And so there are lots of other options that other people contended we had. But nevertheless, we dropped two of them on Japan. All right. And then when it came toward the end of the war, we were less averse to, we became more averse to taking prisoners of war amongst the Japanese. Now, in fairness to the truth, there were highly publicized instances of Japanese surrendering and then blowing themselves up and killing all the Americans in their near proximity, so that their their surrender had been a ruse, right? But still, nevertheless, it got brutal, the fighting in the Pacific and the treatment of prisoners of war. Then you have Operation Magic, cracking the Japanese code, and the Japanese began to be on to us, that we were on to them. So we made the decision to step back and say, you know what, we're not going to warn our boys and make the Japanese think that we have not translated their codes. Because if they do believe that, they're going to end up changing their codes again, and we'll have to start from scratch. So, in not deliberately not warning our boys, that costs lives. That's a decision that costs lives. And then at Schweinfurt, we used bombers, slow, cumbersome, big bombers uh, to basically as decoys to get the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, up into the air so our P-51 Mustangs could take care of them. Right? So we sacrificed those boys in the bombers. That's Dresden there, all destroyed. And then lastly, I say we did not fight for the principles of the Atlantic Charter for the right reasons. Because if we believed in the human dignity of everybody, we would not have treated our people of color the way that we did. Right? So you see here, Mexican Americans saw themselves excluded from the enjoyment of the same rights and aspirations that many of their neighbors took for granted. They were in separate school system and quote brown schools. Those brown schools were vocationally oriented to teach them an immediate manual laboring job rather than classically oriented and to go to a university. There was no genuine effort to push them into college from high school. Real estate agents deliberately did not give loans and asked people to sign contracts that they would not sell or rent to Black or Latino would-be inhabitants. Okay, so you have that and housing segregation. You still have gerrymandering, where they have a big enclave of Mexican Americans and they split it up into 5, 6, 10 different districts and split them into nearby Anglo districts and make them artificially become the numerical minority instead of majority. Right? And look at this, per capita Latino income was not even half of that of their Anglo counterparts. That on average, the Latino in the 1940s made only 968 a year, and their Anglo counterparts made over 2,000. But nevertheless, Mexican Americans fought courageously in World War II. Guy Gabaldon took thousands of prisoners of war at Saipan with his knowledge of the Japanese language. Macario Garcia became known as the daring Mexican who stormed machine gun nests. Okay, some of them earned medals of honor. You had one called the Tank Buster. Cabo Rodriguez was a part of the Death March in Bataan and tried to help others out to get food from the wildlife around, risking his life to do so. But while they're fighting, right, and sacrificing, you have the Zoot riots back here. And with the Zoot riots, um, the um, the Mexican Americans had their own subculture, wearing zoot suits, wearing their hair slicked and kind of long and curly on top, um, listening to certain music, driving certain cars, and so they became identifiable as a subculture and as a demographic. And I don't know the roots of the word, but they became known as Pachucos. Okay, so there's a naval guy stationed at the I want to say it was Newport Beach, one of the beaches in LA, and he takes his girlfriend through LA into East LA where the nightlife was better. And a couple of Zoot Suit guys kind of catcall his girlfriend, and a fist fight ensues, and the Pachuco breaks the sailor's jaw. Sailor comes back, others find out about it, and they want revenge. So they went through the establishments and this enclave, this Mexican American enclave of East LA. They went into the clubs, etc. They searched the streets for any person who even approximated in appearance of Pachuco, and they tried to beat him up, rip off his zoo suit, and burn it in the middle of the street. And so it got so bad that you had servicemen coming from Reno and Vegas to come fight Pachucos. Okay. And then somewhere right around the time of the zoo suits, you had the murder of Jose Diaz at Sleepy Lagoon, and a guy named Hank Levas and his buddies fit the physiological stereotype of the Pachuco perfectly. They had the look, and they were stereotyped. The judge was prejudiced right off the bat against them, and they were convicted. And then subsequently, they found out that another young man had killed Jose Diaz, one of their girlfriend's brothers. And she was not about to rat on her brother until her brother, in turn, had been murdered. And then what could they do to him? So she finally came out with the evidence. So they were innocent after all. Then at the Rapido River in Italy, they were told to cross the river in semi-suicidal fashion against heavy artillery fire. And finally, one of them had the courage to say no and said, "No more of us are going. This is just stupid. This is useless slaughter." And when the military courts took care of it, they actually sided with the Mexican Americans, and said they had a right to say no. Um, Felix Longoria in Texas, he was killed in the Philippines, and they would not bury him in the local military cemetery because he was of Mexican descent. So like I say here, how could the U.S. claim that it was fighting for a war for human universal rights when it treated its, quote, minorities as such? And then the Japanese. They put them in about 2 dozen internment camps. You had cases, right, that people ran with as far as rumor mill. Uh, you had cases of Japanese so-called tourists who were given coordinates of where the ships were located in Pearl Harbor, and being a part of that conspiracy that we subsequently found out about. Um, and so it was the idea, right, that the Japanese were sneaky Um, you also had balloon bombs that exploded in Oregon and a couple other places and killed a handful of people, including children. And then you also had a gentleman who was captured, a Japanese soldier, and he had a map with routes designated on it coming from the West Coast, as if from a West Coast invasion into the Rocky Mountains. And you also had a 30,000 man army that was placed in the Aleutian Islands off of Alaska that looked as if it might constitute a West Coast invasion force. All right. So Americans were freaking out. The military was freaking out. So this was their knee-jerk reaction. And I'm not trying to rationalize it. But they issued Executive Order 9066 and they put Japanese immigrants, right? And Japanese Americans by virtue of the 14th Amendment having been born here, American citizens, right? Japanese Americans of Japanese ancestry. They put both groups, Issei and Nisei, in these internment camps. In Seattle, they said you could bring everything that you can carry and nothing more to the camp. And a lot of them ended up, they couldn't pay their property taxes, etc., while they're in a camp. And so a lot of them ended up losing their property when all was said and done as well. But when they came in, the conditions in them were very Spartan-like. They were surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards told to shoot if you tried to rebel or if you tried to run away. They gave you a questionnaire. If you gave the quote wrong answers on the questionnaire, like your loyalty is to Japan rather than to the US, they put you in Tulare. Tulare is where they put the quote troublemakers. And in Tulare, on their second riot, they fired into the crowd and killed a handful of them. You also had a group of elderly people dispersed throughout the camps that unfortunately died. And it possibly could have been avoided had they had, more instantaneous access to a hospital, right? And then a young Fred Korematsu takes it to the court and says, by virtue of the 14th Amendment, I'm an American citizen and you cannot intern American citizens. And the judges disagreed with him. They said, under civilian circumstances, you are correct, but we are in a state of war in a special time. And this is a wartime emergency, policy. And therefore, the military is allowed to carry it out. So at the bottom here, I say it was a lesser evil at best. Right. And by the way, if you're interested in the book Abiding Courage, it has the history of Black women moving into Oakland and Richmond, working as Rosie the Riveters in the Kaiser shipyards. And it illustrates, yes, they made good money, good relative to other opportunities they could have had and didn't have, but they faced incredible discrimination moving here. Right. So I'm going to stop sharing this and I'm going to go to the Cold War. Now, with the Cold War, what I say is that, you have the social, political, and economic, right? And this is kind of unique as a topic in that the the economic realm improved supposedly during the early Cold War, during like the 1950s. Things looked up by and large for Latinos here in the US. But socially or culturally and politically, they did not. So it was like they were empowered economically, but socially and politically, they were, I don't know if you'd say, provoked, disappointed, frustrated. All right. And that's a combination that sometimes will lead, as we'll get to next, to a civil rights movement. All right. There's a correlation, and I could only generalize on trying to directly attribute causation to it. But so remember, like correlation, right? Uh, the tennis player that tends to win the U.S. Open tends to wear wristbands or something like that. Like it could be absolutely random, and they just simply correlate. Um, but then when you say, okay, the winners wear, or the winners put in more than 40 hours of work, of tennis work a week, they're the ones who end up winning. Then that's causation, right? Because you're having a direct result from something. So I'm not going so far as causation. I'm not educated enough in the social sciences to do that. But I can at least tell you the correlation is that they have found in modern experiments that when they put someone in a social position to face an injustice, however small or big, all right, and this is staged, right? And when they face an injustice, they have found overwhelmingly that those who stand up for their rights, who demand justice, who want to speak with a boss and they're not leaving until they do, et cetera, over this alleged, this planned injustice, um, have been more educated than those who kind of took it in the chin and didn't fight back. So there just seems to be that. There tends to be in history people that have either socioeconomically risen and done better for themselves economically, and or have received uh, an extended education that tend to stand up for their rights more often. And like I said, I'll just mention that as a correlation because I can't begin to have a definitive thesis on why that is. All right. Of course, I could take my guesses, my educated guesses at that, but I won't. So at any rate, you have the GI Bill, and Mexican Americans fought in large ratios and large numbers. So now that they have served in World War II, they're entitled to subsidized college education, the government paying for their college tuition, and also an FHA loan for a house. So hence, right, they're going to develop, just from the GI Bill alone, is going to help develop a quote colored middle class in the 1950s and early 1960s. All right. You also had, and by and large, the government was still kind of doing engaging in deficit spending uh, from the time of the New Deal of the night from 1932 to try to ensure uh, purchasing power for the common person. All right. But also you have the military industrial complex. You have all these new and old industries that have these lucrative contracts with the government to make something related to government, military buildup and home protection, etc. And that is going to open up a myriad of well-paid jobs. All right. When you look at the 50s, you got to think of the president, and that was Dwight Eisenhower. They called him Ike. And Eisenhower was all about deterrence, all about deterrence. Okay. Deterrence is instead of trying to win your neighbors over, right? If you fear that they might try to attack you or your family, etc., the people in the neighborhood, instead of even trying to make that overture to them, you simply put up signs that says the owner carries a gun. Beware of the dog. etc. Right? So that's what deterrence is you're trying to scare your possible enemy away from trying to mess with you. Okay. And so Eisenhower was all about the arms race, the nuclear arms race in particular, with the Soviet Union in this new Cold War at the end of World War II. He was all for that. And he didn't like the idea that it was going to that it could create a police state. He didn't like the idea that it was going to augment the size of the executive. He didn't like the idea of a standing army being so powerful in a time of peace, but he felt it was necessary. He felt it was a necessary evil to try to keep the Soviet Union off our back. And as you probably know, with the Soviet Union, right, when they had their Bolshevik Revolution, we sent what, like 16,000 soldiers to Vladivostok, Russia, and it looked like we were about to intervene on behalf of the Mensheviks against the Bolsheviks, who ended up taking Russia over. Um, During World War II, we did not share the Ultra program of cracking the codes of the Nazis, of Nazi Germany, and the Russians definitely could have benefited from that. With our Lend-Lease program, loaning military equipment to our allies before we got involved in the war. We gave much more to England than we did to Russia, and Russia knew that. And then also Russia begged us to open up a second front on the Western Front. And it literally took us 3 years to do so. And so Stalin felt like we were dragging our feet deliberately. And then not to mention, right, ideologically, we're opposed to each other, right? Communism is for equity. It's for everybody being equal in condition. And capitalism is about equality of opportunity, not equality of outcome, right? We assume from our American political tradition, like Hamilton had written, that there will always be rich and poor. And that's just the way it is. And so, to the communists, they felt like our capitalist system gives in to human greed and rejoices over it. And to us, we felt like our leaders have felt like, forcing equity on everybody is coercive and it goes against human nature and human nature's tendency toward meritocracy, that you should only get what you merit, what you earn or work for. So really, we ideologically were different. Then the Russians, um, they created the oh gosh, what were the name of those? They were organizations that they had in Chicago and Detroit, etc. Oh, Comintern, the Comintern, and it was for fomenting a a quote socialist revolution here in this capitalist country. So they were kind of aggressive about it. And of course, they were aggressive back in Europe. One country after another in Eastern and Central Europe that they, quote, liberated from the Nazi Germans, they forced communism and their own kind of puppet leaders, to be honest, on these countries. So you have, Yugoslavia, Romania, Bulgaria, Poland, uh, Hungary, etc. They'll be known as satellite countries. So when Franklin Roosevelt was president, he just had a way of just kind of overlooking things, being passive aggressive, non-confrontational with Stalin as his strange bedfellow ally. But then he dies of natural causes, and in comes Truman. And when you do great man history, Truman was a much feistier person. Matter of fact, some people go so far as to say that Truman had like a little man's complex. So when Truman comes in, he's like, hey, you need to allow free and fair elections in these satellite countries. We didn't liberate Europe from fascism to make you force communism on them. All right. And then also the Germans said, okay, we came into Berlin first. Berlin's on the eastern sector of Germany. We'll take the eastern sector, and you Americans, French, and British can have the western sector. But Truman put up a fight and said, no, Berlin is too important of a city. We're going to split Berlin as well, even though it's in your eastern sector. And then we had lots of drama over that in Berlin, the Berlin airlift, etc. Um, a group of young kids used RCA radio to make a complaint that they were not able to have the same freedoms and freedom of movement that those in West Berlin had. And they contended that they wanted no partition in Berlin and everyone free to do their thing. Stalin tried to starve them into submission. And so we flew in with bombers, promising we had no weapons, uh, food, um, coal to heat their furnaces, and candy for the kids, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. And so we have a lot of tension with the Soviet Union because that's exactly what the Cold War is, right? It's a time of ideological and geopolitical and military tension and competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. Let me say one more thing on that, and that is the Kennan's telegram. George Kennan, Kennan. He was at the Soviet Union. He had become conversant in the Russian language. And Stalin gives a speech to his Politburo telling them that they needed to apply a higher percentage of their yearly budget into military buildup for the inevitable war against the capitalist countries. So Kennan sent that report in the middle of the night to the White House saying the Soviet Union is planning to fight us. All right. And then what doesn't help is we had a couple cases with the Manhattan Project making the atomic bombs in New Mexico and Los Alamos. We had that. So I'm going to skip this part. Okay, this just shows how Mexican Americans are doing better economically during the early Cold War and pop culture. Let's see here. But at any rate, you had in Los Alamos, you had the Rosenbergs and you had a guy named Chevalier. And they supposedly were selling secrets to our atomic weaponry to the Soviet Union. And then by 50, right around 50, Stalin drops his first nuclear bomb as a test. So now the Soviet Unions have the bomb. We no longer have a monopoly on it. It's no longer our ace up our sleeve. Okay. And so that was huge in the dynamics of our Cold War. And so then there was this fear, right? You also had a guy named Whittaker Chambers, and he went after a guy named Alger Hiss as a State Department high-ranking man who was a spy for the Soviet Union. And it's going to establish, right, a Red Scare here in the U.S. So our CIA is going to get more proactively violent and aggressive in its foreign policy, and our FBI is going to get more oppressive here domestically. So with the CIA, they had something called the duck test. If it looks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it doesn't have to admit that it's a duck, it's a duck. So hence, right, if you engage in some type of property redistribution, you're a communist, whether you admit it or not. You're a communist. And so therefore you need to be overthrown. So we overthrew Jacobo Arbenz Guzman in Guatemala, and we overthrew a guy named Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran for the same reasons. Okay, so we're getting quite militant internationally. We formed NATO as a contingency military alliance in the event of fighting the Soviet Union and trying to gain allies for that fight. And what else did we do? We funded and supported right-wing dictators as long as they were anti-communist. Like Franklin Roosevelt said, He said he's an SOB, but at least he's our SOB. And then also in the 50s, you had the caricature of the Latino being criminally prone, part of a gang. He's likely to stab you. Like, I kid you not. That was the kind of popular stereotype of the Mexican American and of the Puerto Rican American in particular. So you see right there, you are Puerto Rican. Do you carry a knife? And of course, in some of these areas, the the post World War II boom, the early Cold War economic boom, it didn't hit everybody. So some Latino groups were still remained highly impoverished during this time period. So under the Truman Doctrine, we stated that Truman did anywhere an alleged peaceful majority is threatened by the armed imposition of communism by a violent minority, the U.S. is going to come in and defend that peaceful majority anywhere on the globe. So that's going to get us involved in the Korean War from 50 to 53 and in Vietnam. And they go back and forth as to what you would consider constituting the first year in Vietnam, because it was very incremental in steps. Che Guevara said he wanted to institute a worldwide revolution against the American octopus, the American big corporations, oil and fruit companies, etc., in these quote third world countries. So our CIA um, received help about knowledge of his whereabouts in Bolivia and had him killed. Right. And in the Bay of Pigs invasion, uh, it looked bad. It looked poorly for the U.S. because the guy that had been thrown out of Cuba before, uh, he doesn't he doesn't meet Whig liberal standards well. His name was Batista and Fulgencio Batista, and he didn't allow First Amendment rights. He had a lot of people incarcerated as political enemies. Didn't allow freedom of the press. He was a little too friendly to U.S. corporations as they gave kickbacks to him, and he profited from it. And so, at any rate, when the revolution started against him, he didn't have the popular foundation, of popular, popular affection to fight for him. So he fled the country. And a lot of the people that fled with him were also well-connected, well-to-do, upper middle class Cubans that came to Florida. So about 1,300 of them returned to their home island to invade it and to overthrow Fidel Castro, the new leader. And of course, it was a fiasco. Kennedy had promised that he would not invade Cuba as far as U.S. forces, and a Cuban lands in the midst of American press on American soil uh, in his fighter jet, and someone literally during the press conference scratches off the Cuban paint to show that it was an American air vessel. So clearly, Americans had armed them, had trained them, and had even used a disguised American fighter jet to help them. So all these things, right, are sources of frustration uh, for the Latino community and for the entire American community, for that matter. Especially the baby boomers, um, in the midst of the civil rights movement to come, that's coming soon. And then I didn't even mention the FBI. The leader of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, was known as the Czar, the Emperor, because um, he could get warrants to come in and infringe on people's Fourth Amendment rights to their things and their privacy all too easily. He had a large bureaucracy. I'm sorry about that with the dog. Um, he had, yeah, he was just something else. He had a counterintelligence program, okay? And the counterintelligence program spied on people, bugged their telephones, and in some cases even actually got in shooting battles with them. And I'm thinking of the case of the Black Panthers in Oakland. And so, at any rate, you had also HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee, and they're going to have formal trials against Hollywood stars and Hollywood writers and producers, saying that they had a communist leaning in what they wrote, what they created, what they acted out, and it just made the conservative side look ugly, oppressive, like it was like the Salem witch trials all over again. Okay. And there was a guy who kind of made a jerk out of himself, his public image wise. Um, and he's from Wisconsin, a senator. Um, oh, don't film me now. McCarthy, Senator McCarthy. And him lacking evidence and just verbally accosting the person that is being tried became so commonplace that it became known as a euphemism, as a noun, McCarthyism, to just harangue people without any evidence against them. All right. So at any rate, according to this Cold War, what we're doing here, right, is we're doing some structural history on the way to the civil rights movement. How you're going to develop a Mexican American middle class that's going to help lead the Chicano movement, doing better for themselves economically. But you're going to have a very oppressive Cold War kind of, atmosphere and world that they had to grow up in that they tire of. And then international policy of just throwing our weight around, especially in Latin America, some of these people's home countries that they don't take too kindly. All right. So anyway, you guys take care, and that concludes my lecture. Thank you.